Great. Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's really a delight to introduce our speaker today, Jennifer Yoos. I had the opportunity, and I should say privilege, to work with Jennifer at their office, VJAA, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've also had the opportunity to teach with Jennifer at the University of Minnesota School of Architecture, also in Minneapolis. Jennifer is a founding partner and president of VJAA. She's also professor and head of the Schools of Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Interior Design in the University of Minnesota College of Design. VJAA is known for its innovative approach to practice that prioritizes context, environmental, social space, and building craft. Since its beginnings in 1995, the firm has received 23 National Design Awards, including 6 National AIA Honor Awards, 6 Progressive Architecture Awards, and 2 AIA COD Top 10 Green Building Awards. VJAA was the recipient of the 2012 National American Institute of Architects Firm Award. Jennifer received an M.Arch in Architecture and Urbanism from the Architectural Association in London, a professional B.Arch from the University of Minnesota, and a Loeb Fellowship in Urban and Environmental Studies at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. In addition to teaching at the University of Minnesota from 1997 to 2015, she has taught as the NADA, N-A-D-A-A, visiting professor at Cooper Union, and as the Ruth and Norman Moore Visiting Professor at Washington University in St. Louis. She is co-author with partner Vincent James of a monograph on their work published by Princeton Architectural Press, as well as their book, Parallel Cities, the Multi-Level Metropolis. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Yoos.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm trying to move this so I don't have to see my face while I'm talking. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I reorganized this lecture, which is, oh, which ones?
It's overlapping your thing.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's not what you want to see. That one.
Oh, okay.
I want to try.
Hold on. It's asking you something here.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry about that. So I wanted to reorganize this. It was really about a set of ideas that I think are broader, which is how do you practice and why you practice on your own? And I started to think about what would be interesting. I've always wanted to do our lecture on our work in kind of terms of professional practice and talk about kind of how you engage different projects and how you make decisions and how the way you frame your practice, not just in business terms, but in terms of like your ambitions and what you choose to do and how you do it and how that really affects your work. And I think a lot of the things that we encounter in practice that we're frustrated by can really be opportunities. So, which is a little bit optimistic, but I'll show you the first, wait, how does this work? Okay. So the first quote is by the Craftsman, the book, The Craftsman by Richard Sennett. And he says in the book, the use of imperfect or incomplete tools, and he's talking about hammers and wood and, all of the things that we're encountering that give us resistance to our ideas, draw on our imagination and developing the skills to repair and to improvise. The two arguments combine in considering how resistance and ambiguity can be instructive experiences. So the problems that you run into and the things that make your life difficult can really be a good thing. To work well, every craftsman has to learn from these experiences rather than fight them. And I really think this is profound in a lot of ways when you start to think about practice and all of the things that provide resistance for the things that we may want to do when we're starting out. So, why do you make a practice? I worked in, and so did my partner, in large corporate firms. We've worked in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of the things were, because I think having your own firm is harder. You don't know if you could pay yourself. You don't know if you can get work. There are a lot of things about having a business that are difficult. And if you really love design, that's not a natural direction. So why do it? And I think a lot of it is, you can kind of control your own work and what you want to do with your life and how you want to work and who you want to work with and what are your own terms, which is really wonderful. I think all of the things that we encounter in daily practice and everyday practice are things that can be resisted. They are also things that resistance that they push against you, and having those rules and kind of restrictions against us give us more ideas and better ideas. And I think a lot of our work comes out of things that create resistance to us. So our incomplete or imperfect tools in practice are mechanisms we have created. These are things that we've used to organize design processes, like budgets, schedules, zoning regulations, environmental rules, property boundaries, building codes, energy and carbon reductions, material costs and extraction, tools, fabrication methods. So everything is something that is making your design work more difficult, but it's also making it more interesting. And sometimes if you choose to focus on it, it can redirect it so it's not all up to you to kind of pull it out of your pocket. This is my lovely husband a long time ago at a lecture we were doing, and on the right is our office today. We're about 12 or 13 people, and we're organized to kind of, how would I put it? Our size is intentional, and we moved into the office we're in because we didn't want to get bigger, and we hope to not get too much smaller, because it allows us to have projects of any size, to be personally involved in the design of every project in our office. So we don't have like subgroups and sub-designers. We kind of design together, and we work with people collaboratively in our office as designers. A lot of people in our office are designers, project architects, project managers. We don't kind of, we're not big enough to be able to kind of divide people out. So we all kind of do all things. So it's about creating a culture and a community. This is where I teach, and where I'm head of, and it was also, this is Stephen Hall was the lead designer, and then the lower right you see the original building, which was by Thorshav and Cherney from the 50s, the courtyard space, and the project was really connecting the two, and we were the local architect or the architect of record on that project. And it was we finished it in 2003, I think, and it's been really wonderful to come back. I've been head of the school and a full-time, or sort of full-time professor, but I'm really an architect, working in this environment, and it's given me a chance to fix some of our VE items and deferred maintenance. So it's really great to be back here and learn from the building that we were part of. Our practice, I think John mentioned, we really consider it to be research-based. In other words, it's kind of this process of inquiry, and we just look at things and try to pull things in from outside of ourselves to make us think differently. So that's kind of how we use research. And the material experimentation, kind of reuse, whether it's adaptive reuse or reuse of materials, or ideas about environment and social space, architecture as a form of urbanism. Those are things that kind of appear over and over in our work. I also wanted to talk about, like, at lunch, students were asking me like about the ARE, or like, how do you begin certain things? I think one of the most interesting things is like what you do in school and how it influences you later on. So I pulled together a couple of things that I did when I was a student, when I was 20, 21, 22, and how that kind of is still present in our work and my work. On the left, I did a lot of competitions. This was a copper sheet model that I did with a classmate of mine who I'm still close friends with, and it was another glass house design competition. I wish I had the model today, but we don't know where we put it. On the right was another project that I did that was a volunteer project over the summer. I worked nights in bars and had various jobs waiting tables, and so I had my days free, so I did stuff during the summer that was kind of whatever sounded interesting to me. And this was a Russian constructivist exhibition at the Walker Art Center, and we designed and built an art lab, a group of us. I also did something kind of reckless and irresponsible. I got a one-way ticket with my boyfriend to go to London and a work permit, and hoped I would get a job. And I actually did, because it was a weird period of time where they were doing, there were changes in policies that had a big work boom. So I could walk in with a portfolio and get some sort of a job. And I ended up working on the Liverpool Street train station, which was a listed building, and they were totally renovating it, which meant taking it down brick by brick and stone by stone and reconstructing it the same way it was originally. So I spent my whole summer doing drawings and details and drawing it as it had been done and could be built again, which was really an interesting process. And it was all big sheets of vellum, which is animal skin, and was going to be kind of preserved in ink. And so I learned to kind of build up lines in a very different way and to work in a very kind of old-fashioned way, which was also really interesting. I also learned dimensions for the first time in the British system, so I can still remember what a brick is in millimeters, and I can't remember it in inches. So a lot of these things that you do early on kind of influence you and stick with you and kind of remain interests. This is my first job after architecture school. Actually, my first was for an artist. I graduated during a recession and nobody was hiring. And so my first job was working for an artist doing a bridge project who was dating the artist Anne Hamilton, who would show up and hang out in the studio with us while I would build stuff. So it was like a really cool job, low paying, enough to survive on. But my first real job, there was a federal law basically changing the Bureau of Indian Affairs to kind of have all of the work done on the reservations. And all of a sudden the reservations started to build things for themselves and it wasn't being done from outside. This one in particular had a woman who was running it, the reservation, who was very ambitious about rebuilding a lot of things. And she had figured out how it was when casinos started, she used all their casino money to build schools, religious structures, a whole bunch of things, a lot of like early green kind of environmental systems for septic and utilities. So they were really thinking differently, and it was wonderful. I worked on this for 5 years. So the first thing that I learned how to build before I learned conventional building was how to build out of logs and glulam. And I learned to really love wood, and I started to get into kind of experimentation with wood. The project on the lower right was a model I built at the time. I was interested in Will Bruder's Phoenix Library that had the kind of tensai gritty. And so I was looking at lightweight wood, and that made me want to go back to school. So to go from that to the AA was kind of a strange shift. And I remember, so my two main instructors were Winnie Moss from MVRDV and Patrick Schumacher from Zaha Hadid. And I remember telling Patrick what I had done before, and he just looked very disturbed. So his worldview I didn't really understand because both he and Winnie were very young at the time, and MVRDV really hadn't published that much. I think they had done the project, the elderly housing, and he had just kind of been working on the Pharmax and the density project. And Patrick was really very subservient to Zaha and really kind of, this was kind of his first teaching experience as well. And then I had Ed Soja there, who was teaching part of Third Space. So it was a really interesting interdisciplinary studio, and it was architecture and urbanism. And we also had Arup there, in the engineer who worked on the Yokohama terminal. So it was a really interesting kind of environment. And it really challenged for me, like the idea of disciplines and how you think about the role of architecture on a single project, that it really overlaps a lot of different disciplines, and having all of those things part of the conversation, I found really exciting. I also liked the idea that these people didn't agree with each other and that there was all of this conflict out of it. And you could kind of pick and choose from things like what, it forced you to figure out yourself better. Our practice has always been kind of a mix of things. When we started, we really were doing little projects. So we were using house projects to pay for competitions. We were doing little kind of, our first major project that we worked on together was the Minneapolis Rowing Club. And that was, I think, $78 a square foot. It had a dirt floor and no mechanical system. But it was also our first digitally designed project. We worked with this guy who's a friend of John's as well, Jay Lane, who's now at Gary and Partners, and he was our client. And he said, why are you doing this not digitally? Because we were still analog. And he said, I'll help you with the digital model. And we decided to kind of fabricate the trusses so that there was one joint that was customized on each one and allowed us to kind of create this sense of rotation. So like some of these things early on and creating room to experiment, even though we didn't have budgets and you're just learning from people you're working with, were really wonderful. It took us a while to build things and for people to trust us. I think that was part of why we took on the architecture school, and we kind of convinced Stephen Hall, even though we were 5 people and probably not very useful, that we could do that and be the local, which we're still grateful to him for. But we're doing a lot of kind of speculative work. We were doing a lot of pre-designs. Our work at Tulane, the Lab and Bernick Center, started as a pre-design study. And then we would develop them and submit them for like Progressive Architecture Awards. So all of the Progressive Architecture Awards, we stopped submitting when we started to get real projects. And they were a way of like making us visible and making us kind of push ourselves to do larger scale things than we were getting the chance to do in practice. We did a lot of design competitions, well, not a lot, but enough, as much as we could afford. And then installations and exhibitions, you know, things that just helped us kind of push ourselves to not just do kind of garages and small additions to things. We've always also tried to publish and write about what we're doing as a way of thinking about it. My partner and I both would teach 1 semester studio a year, and we would alternate. And then we would try to teach in overlapping ways so that we could develop kind of ideas and build on those ideas and then write on those ideas. He said at one point, we should develop a rule that everything we do has 3 outcomes so that we're not like spread too thin and we have a lot of overlap in our work. So like things about digital craft, we would write about ideas about social space and urbanism, some of the environmental ideas that really helped us to develop them and push them further. The things that kept reappearing, I think, are things that are about kind of social spaces and form of urbanism and the multi-level city work we did. We did in numerous cities. The one in the upper left was a studio I did at WashU. The one on the lower left was a studio Vince was teaching at MIT, and then an exhibition we did together at MIT on, and through our office. And then on the right were some of the writings about and exhibitions about digital design. Many of these, I think on the lower right, you probably see John Ross's work. He was also part of the exhibition in the upper right. And he was involved in a lot of these projects. I can't remember all the details of each one, but so, you know, one of the nice things about having an office is you get to choose who you work with, and that's really exciting. Walker Art Center Open Field was another project that we did kind of pro bono, and in exchange, they basically paid for the publication of our book. But it was an idea about what is a commons and how do you make shared space that's flexible for all things, which was a really fun project. And at the same time, we fixed a leaky roof for them and some problems they had with truck loading and a bunch of practical things. And we made a cool space, and some of the remnants are still there. I picked out every single tree there with the curator in a tree farm. So a lot of the stuff we did was really hands-on. This was our Parallel Cities book that took us 15 years to do, and all the research. We got a Graham Foundation grant, which helped us get it going. Published it in Places. If you don't read Places, read Places. Places is amazing. I'm on the board, so full disclosure. You know, a lot of these things are about these resistances, though. So you have these ideas of what you're doing in your practice and how you're shaping your work, but the things that push back. So these are things that are like specifically building on the rowing club work, things in different materials, but we keep coming back to wood and steel. And kind of what do you customize and how much? And that can also be a budget thing. You know, the rowing club, we couldn't afford more than just like one joint that was variable. And that kind of set restrictions for us. We were very excited about the motion of rowing, oars, water, all of these things that might impact form. But we kept it very simple because we didn't have a budget. So it was really more about lines creating curved surfaces. So this is the interior. We painted, our office painted the first paint job because they ran out of money. So we did a bunch of things. This was an experiment on the right, the Saarinen wall, which we were looking at. The work being done by Charles Eames at the time before he was working with Ray and Eero Saarinen at Cranbrook and the Kazam machine. And we looked at, well, what could you do if you started to think about how is this digitally fabricated and what variations. And our fee for that project was we got to keep the wall when it was done, which is still in our storage. This is a more current project and recent, kind of building on what we learned over the years with wood. This is a rowing center in Toronto for a college, and it's really more CLT and steel, and so it's pushing further. It doesn't have any heating or cooling. It's all passive, and it's on a district system. So when I was filling out the AIA award submittals, and I couldn't give them energy calcs because it doesn't use energy, we discovered because of that we couldn't submit it for a coat. So it's like we've run into these things where you start to do things differently, and it causes frustration, but it also it's interesting, and it gives you something to write an angry letter about. But so these are kind of looking at the systems and kind of how you pull apart the systems. And we think about this a lot and kind of work in this way quite a bit. Where we're looking at, really simple systems that create an interesting section, how that section is extruded, and, really it's all about the detail in the system, and that's exposed, and you're not creating a lot of redundant layers. This one, what we were trying to push was this kind of odd curved roof form. So it was really one simple idea, kind of expanded. The black building is like something we've used forever. The Minneapolis Rowing Club had the wood on the inside and the black, a very cheap hardy board surface. Our house is the same. It's like something that's kind of reoccurred, and we like the kind of the way it disappears. And also has a strong presence that it's not a particular thing. We were also really interested in integrated systems, how structure becomes skin. And this folded gatehouse was an experimental project that was never built, but it made us it made us get Rhino for the first time because we couldn't afford CATIA, and we could direct fabricate with Rhino. And then it also started to help us think of the ways that we were using Rhino to direct fabricate to study kind of integration. The project on the far right is a project that we did in Colorado where everything was being built out of the model. So the Rhino model, I think it was Texla is the integration, but everything was built from the model. So the steel was cut, the railings, the stone, the ducts, all the integration of the systems. And then we also designed this chandelier, and we studied it with different materials, and the idea it would be these kind of aggregate of forms, and the structural lighting, so you wouldn't see the lighting. So the idea would be you'd create this structural cloud of light. But once we designed it, we got the design UL listed, but nobody would build it for us. So we decided we were going to do it ourselves and do it in a simple way. It worked out well. Our daughter was 14 at the time and liked to make stuff, so she built like 2/3 of the cells and did a lot of the wiring, and it's still hanging today. So it probably led to her going to architecture school, unfortunately. But this was the final version hanging up in our office. And again, we couldn't get anybody to take it out to Colorado, so somebody in our office drove it out in a truck, and people met out there, and then we hung it. So this is it in place. And you can see all of the systems. We were also really interested in how you can kind of develop and control patinas. So this is the steel. we worked with an alchemist, which there is such a thing, they exist in the world. And he had really great ideas about, the client loved Richard Serra's work, and how can you get a 30-year patina on a house? Skin was something we didn't think was possible, but we basically created these condensation kind of tents, which you can see behind. So this is the sandblasting, and there was just a mist going in the condensation tent. And what it did was it created these lines, and you would get the mist, and then the water would roll down, and it was kind of the droplets were spaced apart, and it created this pattern that was really surprisingly regularized. So this is the condensation tent. It was kind of like a greenhouse, which is a cool process, and also learned a lot. And it allowed us to kind of play with patinas on all of this Corten steel that were also digitally cut. The lower left shows like how we were playing with like designing everything, since everything was being built from the model, and how all these things could be integrated. The top left is a physical model we were making of the ceilings. We did all these iterative physical things that were digitally and physical, and then you could see how it was actually assembled below with an acoustic material kind of as the inlay. And then this is kind of how it turned out. So we created like these little zones. You never get to do something like this, and it was something that we thought we could learn a lot from. And then it was also, we got this project in 2009 when all of our other projects died during the housing bust. So it kept us from going out of business, and then it allowed us to do, at the same time we did the Habitat for Humanity project in Detroit, we did the Downtown Walker Library, and we kept all of our staff. So that was like a cool thing. And we were able to really push some things we were interested in. One of the other projects that we did kind of early on was I showed the pre-design and P&A kind of submittal for the Blyven Burnick Center at Tulane, and students were asking about that today, that they were using it in the class. And we were really interested because we live in a very cold climate and we don't get to open our windows very often. And the idea that people use balconies as social space and that your buildings are much more porous was really exciting to us. So we were studying the French Quarter block and the idea of a porous block, all of these different entries on the way to the inside, not just one door that has a vestibule and can be like absolutely thermally controlled. And this idea of the kind of porous exterior was really exciting to us because we didn't get to do that. We were also really interested in this idea. We had gotten to know Matthias Schuler from Transolar, of the ideas of like when a building could be open to the exterior, and this kind of shoulder period where people are heating and cooling. And if you use these other methods, you can really kind of expand that. So the building at Tulane was by Curtis and Davis in 1957, a really beautiful modern building, had a lot of ideas coming out of New Orleans architecture. And we were interested in like, could you think about it differently, more like an earlier idea and a contemporary idea of being more kind of permeable, multiple entries, multiple ways through. We developed shading systems kind of based on ideas we saw in New Orleans. This was the progressive architecture submittal. This was I think it was a 10-year project because we went through so many phases of stops and starts and hold. It was under construction during Katrina. This was the Curtis and Davis that had been modified over time, where it was just sealed off and kind of shaded and not as permeable. Our original scheme was really ambitious. We wanted all of the walls to be able to be opened up, which facilities didn't like. And if you've been there, you'll see it's a lot more closed than we had hoped. We developed fans based on regional models. We based chilled water walls. They have a central plant where they create chilled water. So it was an easy resource. And the idea of using kind of radiant to cool in a lot of different ways, including the metal ceilings, was an important part of it. The fans were developed by Matthias Schuler The blades of the fans were developed by James Carpenter, the glass artist in New York, who we were working with on a house project and was interested in this. But we're interested in these kind of balcony and porch spaces and kind of how people are inside and outside and they see each other and they connect. And it's a social idea, but it's also an environmental idea. And we studied a lot of the kind of regional models similarly that we thought were really interesting and could help develop ideas. So when we started to organize the site, we really organized it around zoning and how you permeably kind of heat and cool, but also how you move through at the same time. Let me go through this. I'm taking too long. So this was an article that we developed out of that work in Praxis at the time, talking about how you start to think about programming as an environmental idea, and that the kinds of activities, and this was coming from Transolar and Matthias Schuller, was that if you're doing things that you're active, you're comfortable at a different kind of temperature point, a different humidity, so you start to kind of zone a building programmatically and environmentally and thermally at the same time. So these are some of those diagrams. The solar vents were also kind of developed with James Carpenter. And the idea of moving air to create turbulence, to create comfort, to have different thermal zones in the upper left, people on the right, shading on the lower right. And ideas about displacement cooling and all of the different ways. I mentioned that the project was 50% complete when Katrina hit. So that was kind of a shocking, disturbing process. A lot of things changed in the project because of what the campus was dealing with, and a lot of the things just ended up being simplified or VE'd out of it. The budget got reduced. So there were a lot of things that kind of didn't work, but we're still happy with the project. Around the same time that project was going on, so 2003, we won a competition at the American University in Beirut. We had gotten to know Hashim Sarkis, who was teaching at the GSD, and he put us on the list, and we got shortlisted, and then we won the competition just before we moved to Boston for the Loeb Fellowship. So unfortunately, when we were 50% construction with that project, the Lebanon-Israel war started, and one of our architects was there, who managed to commandeer a taxi and get out through Syria. So it's all of these things are interesting where things take you, because this was just a competition we entered and started to win. But we learned a lot from New Orleans, and a lot of it was applicable to Beirut. And the ideas about environment and social space, the ways that people interact and kind of are outside at different times of the day. The environmental issues were different, particularly around humidity and about the way air moves. So we developed these diagrams, and we would have these meetings with Matthias Schuller from Transolar, and he would take pot shots of them. And our first was that the idea of the big landscape and the big building didn't work. We were interested in matte buildings from our multi-level urban research. And we started to look at, what if you created courtyards? And Matthias said, well, that doesn't work here. This is not an arid climate. You really need to take advantage of the cooling and kind of flushing of air movement, kind of from the sea at night, and also from the hills kind of coming down. And so we broke everything apart, and we started to think about how people moved and how air moved, and that there was both a vertical migration to rooftops at night, and there was also kind of movement of the building shading courtyards. We reversed the logic of kind of the shading orientation, which I'll show you, but we did a lot of things kind of using radiant, displacement cooling, and we really tried to develop this, which you can really see in the section of kind of different strategies. The gym is really shaped like a bowl because it's really holding cool air and it's dropping from above. It was kind of a larger urban project. It was on the Corniche, the most public area in Beirut, and had a tunnel to connect to the beach. And it's a very active area. Um, the master plan that was created by Saki mandated the upper orientation, and we argued for the reverse, largely because of the way the wind was moving, which is more like the streets in the city. And we argued that you could condition the walls. I think we were the first cavity wall in Lebanon that was insulated and controlled. And instead of orienting the building against solar, you would basically use the buildings to shade the space in between. And so that created these very strong walls in the project, the air moving through. And this was under construction, or just constructed. These are recent. We were last there in 2019, just before the pandemic. We did a number of competitions with them, and we were shortlisted. We came in second. Snøhetta won the competition, but it's never been built because they've encountered one problem after another. You've probably seen about the explosion, the problem with the bankings. There's just so much going on in Beirut that it's really hard to kind of do more on campus right now. These were an exterior version of the water wells we developed at Tulane. So another idea that I think is another form of resistance, the other was really about environmental rules, kind of environmental conventions, how we think about how we build. This set of resistances is zoning, historic district, property boundaries, the things that we also kind of struggle with. A project that we started also kind of right after, we got it just before the 2009 crash, was the Walker Library. And it was an underground building that had all of these problems. It was an odd, inefficient footprint. They couldn't staff it because they had to have staff on multiple levels, so it was half closed. They could really only afford staff on one level. So they really needed a one-story library. They had gone through a process where they tried to combine it with housing, but because of the housing crash, they pulled the housing out. So it was kind of a confused project, and then they reduced the budget by 50% because of the economic crisis. So we had a really low budget. We used a very conventional kind of roofing tile for the facade, which was a challenge for them because they didn't like to try things they hadn't tried before. It was with the county, but we explained it had a 50-year warranty. So everything about this was conventional systems, but we did things that were slightly variations. So the soffits, are kind of a customized kind of metal to match the off-the-shelf tiles, roofing tiles, the window, the flip of the window. It's a standard system, but that kind of flip of the base was something we did. And so you can kind of see the project was half on a residential district and had a weird setback, and then half on commercial. So we used the residential setback to kind of create an entry. We leveraged the 8-foot difference between one end of the site and the other to raise the floor. So a lot of the things that were kind of restrictions, sorry about that, I don't know why that keeps popping up, to make the project kind of more interesting to us. We have problems in Minneapolis with snow plows and snow at corners, and so we kind of pulled the facade back so people could get around the corner in the winter, and they could kind of pile up snow. So all of these different kind of relationships were really about kind of different contextual rules and things that could be broken. The interior, the flip truss at the bottom is also kind of I tried to do that once in school and I was laughed at by my structures TA. But this was actually for a reason that was structural. So the glass, just kind of hanging glass, you see that the light cubes are really catching light from a different direction. So the intensity of the different colors, they're just painted yellow at the top, so nothing fancy. They just change at different intensity as the sun moves. So a lot of the kind of tactics were about light. 825 Arts is another long-term project. This has been 7 years. And they're really amazing. They're in the Frogtown Rondo neighborhood, and there was this old theater that the community wanted to save. And it had been a theater, then a speakeasy and jazz club and a lighting store, and then had been empty for about 25 years. So it was crumbling. You could kind of get in and out. It had no electricity. It was just pouring water on the inside. And the community wanted to save it. It had an interesting history, and it was also right on the light rail that had just been put in, a really important street for the community. And they wanted to create a kind of community arts group where people could just go and perform. They could see stuff happening. Kids could hang out after school, and it could do all of these things. But they didn't own it. They didn't have money to renovate it. So it was kind of a project that we did for very little, kind of to start. One of the things that they opened up was interesting, and there were two things that were key. One was there was a community land trust, and it was going to be kind of bought by a developer, and they were going to tear it down and build housing there. So the community land trust basically bought the building and then sat on it until they could raise money to buy it. And in the meantime, we developed things that helped them raise money. One of the things they also did was to get the building kind of on the National Register of Historic Places. And they did that because it had a famous piece of music composed there, not because of the architecture had any integrity, but it had a piece of music called Moonshiner's Dance, which was in the Smithsonian kind of Folkways edition, the only one in kind of the upper Midwest in that list. And that had been really influential in kind of the music scene, and Bob Dylan, who's a Minnesotan, and Prince, and kind of the building of our music scene. A lot of the spaces, we really wanted to kind of look at the history and preserve the history, and then also make flex spaces. This was opening day last summer. And you could kind of see the layers. We used the upper access stair as kind of a balcony and kind of overlook and kind of pull people up above. It's used for different kind of creative ways of performing, but you could see all the murals and things that we preserved on the walls. Those were from the speakeasy. The columns are from the theater days. And the whole building acts as a stage for the streets, and everything opens up and people can kind of come and go. The theater itself is really flexible and has a green room, and kind of we used Kierkegaard in Chicago. That was the only thing we really blew our money on for fees, to really get good sound and good lights. These are some of the residue. A kind of community room that they also use for performances, and a radio station. It's really heavily used all the time. They have double Dutch jump roping competition that goes on there weekly, and then it's right on the light rail, so people can get there. Another resistance we have as an interest is typologies, and a lot of these typologies that have changed over time, and design ideas really haven't, and so you really can't tell the difference. Particularly rest stops and shopping malls we find really interesting. Movie theaters as well, as in the previous example, which was an old movie theater. But this is our first of two rest stops. The second one is under construction right now, and it's the Minnesota Welcome Center on 94. This is the one that's the gateway to the Boundary Waters in the north on I-35W. It had a really low budget and a conventional budget, but their budget assumed that it was a complete redo. And so we looked instead at like what on the site could we keep and modify. We modified all the trails, we modified the site shelters. And so we didn't tear that up, and we did things that we thought would make this more of an attraction for tourists and for people to hang out and spend time. One of the things that we really loved about this project was the idea that the Minnesota Department of Transportation had, which is it's in public interest and safety for people to slow down and stop and hang out here. So we looked at all of the 35W rest stops there. I can't remember the author who did this, but somebody did a really great study looking at rest stops around the US, who was a photographer. The one on the upper that isn't shaded over is what was there originally. So you could see the circular form, you could see the Witch's Tower. The site had been hit by a tornado. So we were trying to see what was there, and the people from MnDOT, their in-house person had designed it, and it was special to them. And people had been stopping there for decades and had memories of this kind of odd-shaped rest stop. So that became a criteria whether we could save the building or not. And it ended up, because of all the plumbing and the new toilet requirements, that we couldn't save the shell, but we could save the footprint. So this is where we developed it. And we basically kind of doubled and expanded it to get the required number of restrooms to meet code. All of the rest stops always had a playground, and we designed the playground. We designed a shade system and benches for people to sit and watch their kids play. Really thought about this bridge element. And the big part of this site is there's a hidden creek that nobody could see. So we wrapped this bridge around, and this is what we use the funds we saved from the site work to overlook the creek and for people to just kind of spend time and hang out on the bridge, which really started to become more like a porch. So you could kind of see on the inside looking out. We also did the art piece on the wall. That's a map of the site and the topo and the creek, so people understand what they're seeing and what's beyond and spend more time here. We use kind of standard highway materials because that's what's most easy. And if you've done highway work, there's so many regulations about what kind of steel you can use, where it's made, where stuff is fabricated. So we really tried to use what was familiar and accessible. Another 10-year project that we just completed is Minnesota Museum of American Art in St. Paul. And that is in a really interesting project, kind of the first bit of architecture that St. Paul ever invested in. St. Paul is our capital. We're two buildings, the Pioneer Tower building, which was by a Chicago architect in the 1890s, and the Endicott by Cass Gilbert that wrapped it, that was going to be a commercial arcade for shopping. And it was really modeled after the arcades of Paris, and the idea of these open air arcades, which if you haven't been to Minnesota is a really bad idea. This is what was developed. And the building is beautiful, and there's so many wonderful drawings that we saw over time. What was interesting about it was how much it had been changed over time. And the Skyway system was added in the 1960s as a way to kind of rejuvenate downtown shopping. But the need to rejuvenate downtown shopping happened in the 1890s and the 1910s and the 1930s and the 1950s. And with every kind of new idea about how to get people excited about shopping downtown, they came up with a new kind of architectural idea that was equally bad and awful. And so when we started this project, the buildings were bought by a developer who was turning it into housing and was using historic tax credits. So they didn't say, well, everything going back to Cass Gilbert is the best thing, and you can kind of turn it back into where it was at its best. It was every layer was historic. So we went through this long process of trying to negotiate about how do you take out something, how do you rationalize removing something. So the version on the lower, they had dropped the vault because people were dropping beer bottles through the glass from the housing above. So they lowered the vault. There was an Art Deco edition. They also did, if you look on third from the top on the right, they did a flat ceiling in the modernist period. They filled in the alleys. They filled in all of these wonderful kind of in-between spaces. And we just thought that there were a couple of things that we were stuck with. One was the Skyway system. The other this was a conjoined block. But we really wanted to pull out all these urban layers again and use that to organize. The challenge with the two-level circulation is that you don't connect the street to the upper level, and you kind of follow this kind of labyrinth from parking to the interior, and it's really hard to navigate, and so people wouldn't come here. So the whole thing was about connecting. But then we started to work with the museum, even though they had a small footprint, with the developer to program everything around art and art kinds of spaces. So that would start to activate some of the retail on the second level, which it has. There's a chocolate factory where the hair salon is, and these things didn't turn out as intended, but it's all busy and full because the museum's there and people come to the museum and hang out. So this is kind of how you could see the commercial glass arcade, the L-shaped in green. The Skyway Bridge turns into another interior Skyway Bridge that crosses over the old coal yard where they used to bring horses and bring coal in. And the infill over the alley space. We've treated the alley as a space again. So it was really like trying to emphasize the parts and program them similarly like we did with Two-Lane Environment, but this was kind of these urban layers. This had been all bricked in, so you couldn't see to the interior. And I have a really great email from Cass Gilbert to the owner who was pissed off because the owner was trying to argue that if he took the columns off and sold the columns, he could get more signage and get more tenants. So fortunately, the owner found that the columns were like too hard to take out and would cost him more money, and he dropped the idea and we got to use them. This is the old space, which used to be exterior. And you know, pretty much everything you see there isn't Cass Gilbert, but a lot of the material remnants are and kind of are reassembled. This is the Skyway Bridge we made from the Skyway system into the elevator, which goes over the coal cart, which is kind of a vertical sculpture gallery. The old lobby. We design a lot of furniture just because some of our projects take a while and we just do stuff to kind of keep going. So we designed the chairs, the stools, the tables, the desk. Someday, if we hit another like slow period, we'll open up a furniture company. So these walls were all buried in drywall. You couldn't see arches. The arches were all bricked in. So a lot of this was kind of pulling out layers. You couldn't see any of the stone or brick in the alley. This is the old alley space. But this is the kind of layers of space it creates by kind of pulling all of these things together. We took down every bit of glass and restored every piece of glass and put it back in. The one piece that we found of Cass Gilbert was one single column capital, one cast iron column capital that during one of the renovations they had taken them all out, but they didn't take one out. So we used that to create a mold to create new ones. And that was one of the restoration pieces we did. This is the L-shaped permanent collections gallery. Some of the original details. That's the column that we were trying to find forever. You can see on the lower right, in the middle, that's the old 1980s version of the shopping mall. Those are pictures I took when we first moved in. Was absolutely horrible in the bricked-in entry. One of the other things that we find interesting is kind of the resistances that property ownership and control is, and kind of who is your client. One of our projects that we have that I really love is a project we're doing for MHA Nation in North Dakota. They have all of this land in the Badlands that is kind of untouched and beautiful and pristine, and nobody knows it's there and nobody goes there. And when we got this competition, Shannon Nickel and I from GGN interviewed for it. And it's an odd client because all of the power is held by the women, and they do all the building and they do all the construction and design. So it's kind of an unusual experience for women designers to kind of go there and work in that context. This is the first Mandan, one of a series of early Mandan villages. This is Double Ditch. And this is why the 3 affiliated tribes exist. The Mandan, there were about 10,000 people living in this area. This is one of their largest villages of earth lodges. And this is a site that exists now that just exists as it is, where the earth lodges have collapsed over time, and you can kind of see this landscaped with the residue of these homes. Because the smallpox decimated all of these villages. And there were 8 to 10, I think this was the largest, but there were so few people at the end of the smallpox epidemic that they formed the 3 affiliated tribes so that they could have enough people for one village. So it's kind of a shocking sight and horrible, but it's, we were asked when we got the project to do a lot of reading. I've never had a reading list this long. The MHA, there are a lot of members of the tribes who have PhDs and have done a lot of kind of scholarly work. And the Mandan and Hidatsa and Arikara have been here for generations. These are drawings of, the top is Sitting Rabbit's map of the Missouri River and all of the villages along the Missouri River. I think this is 1907. The other is kind of similar period on the lower left. On the lower right is the construction of the Garrison Dam by the Army Corps of Engineers to dam up the Missouri River. So the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara were in agriculture and trade, and were really successful. They did a lot of kind of plant engineering, agricultural one of my favorite stories is they developed a species of corn that was blue, that was low enough so it would hide in sage grass so people wouldn't see how much corn they had. They also engineered another that a red corn that could store over winter very easily. So there was a lot of like deep knowledge about plants through their agriculture and gardens. This is the Garrison Dam, and the Army Corps of Engineers, you could tell this was not a happy moment. They basically had installed the Garrison Dam to create electricity and flooded the bottomlands. So the 90% of the Fort Berthold Reservation was flooded, and you can see the area beyond. So they really had no choice but to kind of trade their land for land that was dry. They were given land that really wasn't agricultural, and it was up on the bluffs. And that's kind of the next phase of the story. So this is kind of a quote from that period of time. We will sign this contract with a heavy heart. With a few scratches of the pen, we will sell the best part of our reservation. Right now, the future doesn't look too good to us. And this is their future. So the land that they were traded has about 95% of the state's oil on it. And so while they aren't in the business of oil, they tax it. So because they're a sovereign nation. On the left is one of the roundhouses, and it was kind of one of our first visits and conversations about their history. And one of the things I found interesting, they were talking about their traditions and kind of the gender roles. And they were talking about how if a woman owns the lodge and the family lives in the lodge, she constructs it with other women, and the men go out and hunt. Men traditionally went out and hunted. If the woman didn't like how the husband was behaving, she would put his stuff outside the lodge. And so there was like this really kind of disproportionate power that was interesting to watch. This is overlooking the Badlands. We spent 4 days in ATVs kind of looking over the traditional reservation lands. This is the Missouri River on the upper right. My first time in an ATV. These are some traditional kind of practices. These are in the Smithsonian Library. The upper left, when we were talking about forms that we were hired to do a visitor center for their tribal park that it might take, they said, don't make a traditional kind of native form because that's how we were in that time. But the things that we did over time and how we lived are really important to us. So the manager of the project said, the eagle trapping is a really interesting form to us. And kind of being on the bluffs is very different than an earth lodge kind of in the bottomlands. Methods of gardening and preserving food were really important, and kind of this thing that kind of was their livelihood and the center of their extensive trade. This is Shannon Nichols' drawing about the bluffs and the kind of overlook and this kind of importance of the land. And so they really wanted everything to kind of come out of ideas about the land, and that the land is the thing that shapes people. And, this really contextual view of things was really interesting, that kind of all of the animals, all of the people, all of the plants really come out of a particular reaction to climate and place. So this is the Badlands. These were some drawings. On the upper left is a fish trap, and on the lower left is the eagle trap that they were interested in kind of looking at in terms of like how are we constructing, how are we making things and experiences. The plants, the medicinal plants that they're studying and shredding. So we started to look at the land and how the land was formed. We looked at the movement of wind and water and the movement of the river over time as how do you create something that kind of resonates with this landscape. We also looked at kind of butte forms, some of these constructed forms, and we looked at two variations. of kind of a river kind of developed form and a kind of butte developed forms, and developed two sets of ideas. An important part of what they were interested in, the building would work like a clock, where what you do in the building follows the sun, follows the wind, really connects to the sky. They would like to be in the top and talk about star stories. But this would really be a national park, and it wasn't meant for just the tribe, but meant for everybody who passes through. And they were hoping to connect tourism. So they worked with the local communities who were also really interested in tourism. The National Park Service worked with them to develop trails. I think they got a $15,000 grant for that. And then the idea is how do you connect to a larger Badlands environment and experience? Because there's, I think it's Theodore Roosevelt Park further to the west, but this area really is kind of untouched. And so this is the bluff form. This is a stair to view the sky and the stars at night. We still don't know which direction we're going. We're starting up in a month for the next phase. But a lot of it is about how do you create spaces for markets and kind of informal things for people to connect with. So it's about sharing space and culture. The River Learning Center is another project we've been working on since 2016. And the Falls, which is also another 15-year project. Minneapolis really has had its back to the river. It was really used for kind of industry. And it is also part of the lock and dam system. So everything about the water levels is very controlled. And it's basically a large kind of concrete controlled trench with the locks and dams that control the water. The Army Corps of Engineers has started to decommission the locks, and they've put barriers because they don't want invasive species to go further upstream. So this lock and dam has kind of been shut down, and it's only used for flood control. So the city, it's really in the heart of the city. So they've wanted to look at what the lock could be. And this is another kind of shifting topology is what do you do with this large piece of concrete in a city? And how do you program it? And we were hired by a developer to look at a number of different ways to program and activate it. And the developer was interested in, well, could you put parking? Could you put a convention center? What is the pro forma that would like support, the construction on this lock? Could it be a park, but then all these other things pay for the maintenance of the park? So there were a lot of different studies. It's tied into the railroad bridges and an extensive park system downtown. And we developed a number of programs. We were looking with the National Park Service as having an office. We were looking at kind of educational and exhibit spaces and performance spaces. So there were a whole number of tenants and partners, portaging kind of through canoes up and through. Another important part of this project was Spirit Island. And this was a sacred site for the Dakota, and the Falls was an important site for 1,000 years for the Dakota. So the Dakota became very interested in being a partner in this. And then at some point they became interested in kind of taking over the project, and the city was very interested in kind of giving this project up to the Dakota. The Spirit Island project was a site that for the Dakota, women would go there to give birth. It was a kind of healing place. People who were sick would go there. When the Army Corps of Engineers built the dam, they removed Spirit Island. So what do you do to get this back? It really can't be back. But they felt like the historic location still had an energy, the falls itself. The falls is shut off so the water doesn't come through. And so like pulling through, some of these things and bringing back the water, bringing back the green space, kind of restoring the edge and becoming a landscape was important. I'm going to flip through some of this. Another project we've been working on with Lakota artist Deani Whitehawk, this is her show in the Whitney, is our chemistry teaching building. And she's doing a 7-story glass art installation in that piece. So there's a lot of interest in the relationships between kind of native groups and the historic connection to the river, including the River Learning Center, which is another recent project. And the River Learning Center is, again, part of this radically changed kind of river area. The floodplain forest, the upland bluff flows, the creeks and inlets that people historically came through, and these series of 200- and 300-year-old trees that exist on the bluffs. But over time, it was used for a lot of industry. The Ford plant used this to mine sand for glass to create glass. There are construction sites for towers that were confiscated by the city. All of these there's an active marina now. But all of these things were carved away for different uses. And then when the use failed, it was kind of abandoned. So the city has been looking at this site as a site connecting to public schools, to a number of different river entities, to the public park system, and creating a whole series of kind of connections and overlooked a welcome station on the bluff by the elder trees, the witness trees, and kind of building on the bluff. So this is kind of the overall project of the elder trees. National Park Service is one of the tenants. This is the Minra River Gorge, which is about 70 miles of river parkway. It's also the St. Paul City Park. And so there are all of these different partners. These are those trees. So everything was about kind of working within that footprint around the trees, and a whole series of different programming, educational programming around boats, and the marina itself that kind of funds some of the educational program. So a lot of these different kind of partners, I think there are like 12 different partners in this project. The last is a project I mentioned that was a student project, kind of building on some work that we had done that was speculative early in our office. And it's a cross-studio connection between landscape architecture and architecture. The project that we did kind of early on was a natural history museum in Cable, Wisconsin. And we were interested in how the trees and everything that was artificial and everything that was natural kind of merged. There's this strangeness of fish and taxidermy and kind of forestry practices, lumbering, that relocation, and how do you start to restore a landscape, and what does that mean? This won a PA award a number of years ago. We were interested in land art and people like Hans Hock, like how do you process waste and land, artists like Mel Chin. And so a lot of it was around this idea of phytoremediation and how do you process different kinds of waste? How do you collect things from the outside? How do those start to become exhibits? And how do you slowly like change the landscape through plants? We stopped there. The project wasn't built. But the last few years we've been developing. Last year I did a studio jointly with 10 by 10, who we also worked with the River Learning Center on, Maura Rockcastle and Ross Altheimer and their firm, and obsession with Pig's Eye Lake, which is a 30-year-old dump that 3M used for PFAS. It was an unlicensed dump, so it basically has everything, chemical barrels, metals. There's an old battery dump there. And the city at one time, it was a Superfund site, but it never really kind of got cleaned up. And it's one of the most toxic sites on the Mississippi. So the studio has really been focusing on what can you do besides hauling out all the soil, and what can you do over time. So we've been working with the city and the Pollution Control Agency in St. Paul, what's called the Pig's Eye Task Force, that have been doing tests with the chemistry department on campus, and really just studying like, what is this site? It's one of those odd collisions of heron rookery, the largest heron rookery in the Midwest, an active port terminal, the wastewater treatment plant, a park, and a lot of an old abandoned dump that continues to seep into the lake. So a lot of it was like understanding the wells and the chemicals. This is Mel Chin's remediation field, which was done on the site as an experiment in the 90s, using poplars and pennyroyal and other plants to extract metals. And his idea was you could burn the plants, extract the metals, sell the metals, plant more plants, which was kind of a beautiful circular idea. So we kind of took Mel Chin, and the studio is called Suspicious Minds, which he was singing at one of his lectures, and we liked that title. And we spent a lot of time as students just exploring. One year we went to New Orleans. Last year we went to the Fresh Kills landfill to really understand projects that are about river restoration, river reclamation, pollution control, and what are all those shoes? This is Pig's Eye. Those are artificial islands created by the Army Corps of Engineers as bird habitat, but it was used, they relocated toxic soil from the Chemlon plant in Hastings to this site. So it's kind of you take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And so these are some of the projects kind of building on how can phytoremediation start to become architectural, and some of the experimentation students were looking at. Everybody took a different piece of the site, understood the toxins there. This was by the rail yard. How do you process rail yard waste and prevent it from getting into the water? This was looking at how do you create a clean zone of water with the islands and using different kind of natural plants and animals to try to process waste. This was looking at the old Bassett Creek and turning PFAS into bricks. Redirecting the creek as it was originally so it would process waste better. So a lot of the things that the students developed using different plants, this was using conventional kind of filtration systems to create an architecture when they're usually buried. And that's the last one. So that's an ongoing project that we're working on. We just got an SOM research prize grant for it for the next few years. So that's it.